So we will be hearing from Tamika Butler, after which we will get, as I mentioned, a great panel of local leaders. We'll have Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins, Eulois Cleckley, the Director of the Department of Transportation and Public Works for the county, and Grace Perdomo, Executive Director of Transit Alliance Miami. They will all be introduced at greater length later and will be moderated by our fabulous board member, Grace Crunican. So you have that to look forward to after Tamika's remarks. But first, Tamika Butler is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion. She is the principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, and has also previously held the roles of Director of Equity and Inclusion at Tool Design, as well as Executive Director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. Again, we were thrilled that she accepted our invitation to be with us at this conference. Sorry that she cannot be here in person, but very grateful that she is still joining us. Tamika, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me and making it work. It's a little meta right now. I can see myself twice, but hopefully this still translates. You're gonna see my slides most of the time as opposed to me, but I'll keep us on time so you can get to the great response panel. Thank you again so much to the organization for putting together what I have seen on social media, and what I was looking forward to would be a great conference. Sorry that I cannot be there in person, and I'm gonna try to make it through this whole thing without coughing or falling asleep, because that's what I've mostly been doing. So with that, let me go ahead and share my slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit about community-centered transit. I always like to start, if you've seen me speak before, a lot of the stuff you're gonna see is gonna be familiar. And I always tell people it stays consistent because we still need to see change. And one of the ways in which we need to see change is the way that we not only acknowledge, but truly incorporate Indigenous people into our work. Whenever you're thinking about community-centered anything, we have to think about Indigenous folks, especially when we're thinking about things like transportation and climate change. There's so many lessons to be learned from those who were the caretakers before many of us landed on this settled land. And so I always encourage folks, especially in our field, to really be thinking about this. And so, who am I? I'm Tamika. I have my own consulting firm, TLB Consulting. And through my consulting firm, I work on a lot of things. I work with a variety of clients, whether or not it's counties or national organizations, or organizations like MetroLink, where I help them to do research and write reports. And I would say, a lot of it is based on transportation and sustainability. I also do some freelance writing, and I work with a lot of emerging mobility clients and think about the way that technology can be harnessed for transportation good. And then in my free time, I'm also on the board of Transit Center, which I also like to disclose because I use a lot of Transit Center stuff. But for folks who know me, they know I'm also getting a PhD. I'm in the second year of a PhD program at UCLA. Let me tell you, when you're on a quarter system and there are only 10 weeks in a quarter and you have COVID for 2 of them, the PhD is a little frightening. But my interest and the reason I wanted to get a PhD is to really focus on why and how people travel, the relationship, like how do we build environments spatially and think about race and poverty and transportation, and then what's going on with Black geographies and neighborhoods. For folks who are like, that's a lot of gobbledygook, what does that mean? I always tell folks that all the work I do is centered and really rooting for everybody Black. I just truly believe that when my folks get free, it's gonna uplift all of us. And so that's really how I center all my work. And so, it's hard to talk about transportation or transit or community without thinking about the summer of 2020, right? And this is an image that is seared in so many people's minds, where someone is gasping for their last breath with with a knee on their neck. And there was a lot of response in our industry to this moment of racial injustice, to this public lynching, right? And it didn't matter if you were a small town and you were dedicating park space, our territories, right? U.S. territories, places as far as Guam were protesting. There were new nonprofits created. Universities were putting out statements, right? And all over transportation agencies. I think this is King County. I think this is supposed to, represent that Black Lives Matter. And so everywhere you looked, essentially, right? As an industry, we were trying to respond to this, but also every sector, right? I said universities there in Miami, right? We saw this happen all over the country. Police trying to figure out, what do we do? And so there was this moment where all of a sudden a lot of folks said, what would it look like to reimagine policing? And for a lot of us in our space, we have to think about what that would mean for transit. What does that mean for fare? And the fact that we know that in many places, Black and brown folks will disproportionately get stopped for fare evasion, right? What does that mean for departments of transportation? Do they take over traffic stops? What does that mean for workers? What does that mean for the workforce, right? So these were things that on the local level, everyone was talking about. And then we had a new Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Pete, and all of a sudden we started hearing things from the highest offices that many of us have been saying in our communities. Highways are racist, right? That our built infrastructure is a way to stop mobility, right? There's this theory in war that sometimes people try to maim the enemy, not kill them, maim them. And it seems like it's more compassionate, but the reality is it stops folks from being able to live their full lives. And something I always try to say is the way we build infrastructure in this country is a form of maiming. We might not completely kill folks, but the way our infrastructure is built is to make life hard to live for some of us. I always say there is a reason we say the other side of the tracks, right? And so we've now seen this executive order that says that equity and underserved communities have to be front and center in all we do and our thinking about built environments, right? And our thinking about environmental justice and our thinking about transportation. And so now, as agencies, as professionals, as consulting firms, as universities, right? We're all thinking about it. I want to think because that summer and that image really made us realize that we have to change. Like, that's what the goodness in my heart says. The cynical side of me says, well, now we realize that dollars are attached. And because dollars are attached, we're going to do things differently. But it's really hard to do things differently when we know that we're used to doing things a certain way. So the example I always like to use is during that same summer, all over the country, a lot of departments of transportation started these slow streets programs, right? Where we would close our streets and try to get people out and be active. This is my slow street in my neighborhood here in Los Angeles. And I think the program in Los Angeles was great. One of my mentors and friends is Salita, and she brought together community members and talked about how will this work? What do we do? How do we make sure this is equitable, right? But the reality is that didn't happen everywhere. And so we had all these folks trying to do the right thing. Let's start sidewalk dining. Let's start slow streets. Let's make our communities, let's get people outside and bring people back together. But we were still planning things in ways that centered the experience of able-bodied, cisgendered white folks, right? We were engaging still in planning practices that, despite our best intentions, were centering whiteness. And we thought we were including the, the everyman experience and perspective in these things, but we were really only thinking about how people experience place and space as they move through those places and spaces in white bodies. So we're telling people, if you can pay enough, you can be on this sidewalk in this dome that looks like a tent. But if you're unhoused and you're on that same sidewalk in a tent, you deserve to be removed, because we shouldn't have to see that, right? And the reality is that this was all happening at a time where, for Black folks, I don't know if I want to be on a slow street. I know that a young man walking with Skittles, on his street, I know a young man jogging in his neighborhood on a slow street, they lost their lives. And so sometimes we plan things with the best intention, but we don't think about the fact that the way that those spaces are experienced diverge radically based on who you are in this country, right? And whenever I want to talk about racism, I always have people say, well, I don't want to talk about that. That doesn't sound fun. So fine. Let's talk about transit, right? I know one of the exciting parts of this conference is that, there's a new name, right? Mpact, and really thinking about mobility and community and possibility, right? And when I think about especially mobility and possibility, I think about the way that when we invest public dollars, right, not only do we cut greenhouse emissions and create jobs, but we make transportation and we connect people. When we think about mobility, we can think about upward mobility, right? When public transportation stations are available and designed, again, not just for the able-bodied, it can change lives. I don't do this work. I used to be a nonprofit lawyer. I used to be a civil rights lawyer, and I came to transportation. I worked at a bike coalition, and I fell in love with this profession. I fell in love with it so much, I'm getting a PhD. My wife doesn't understand why, and some days I don't. But the reality is that it's because I know that it is life-changing. I know the way it can change lives, right? I also know the way that, as I said, we tie some strings to this equity. And when we give a little bit of money for public transportation funding, it's one of those win-wins that all government agencies love, right? And in my generation, the millennial generation, we've seen this rebirth. We've seen people wanting to use public transportation, wanting to be in transit-oriented communities and really experience what that life is like when you don't have to have a car, right? And when it is working well, transportation is great, right? Transportation is the backbone to so many things. I always say to folks that it is interconnected to so many things. It intersects. I can't get to quality, affordable healthcare if I can't get there. I can't get to education if I can't get there. And I always say that is intersecting. I had someone tell me the other day, it's not intersecting, it's interlocking, right? Because when transportation is going well, it's the center of the world, but people don't realize it, because when it's seamless, it's great. But all of us who work in transportation knows that when it goes bad, that's when folks start to notice, right? And so when we think about transit-oriented communities, where we think about cities where it worked, when I think about places that used the pandemic and really saw some differences, I think about places like Paris, right? And when people do things right, you could say they make it hard to get around by car, and they make it easier to get around by all of these other modes of transportation. But I feel like I'm speaking to the choir. You all know this, right? So does that make it community-centered? And again, when I stop just talking about all the good things and I say, well, is this community-centered? Is this centering anti-raceness? I get those looks. Like, why do we have to talk about this? But I feel like at this organization, at this conference, where we understand, and all those slides I just showed, we understand the promise of mobility. We understand the possibilities that mobility gives us to really impact lives. Like I said, game-changing, right? We understand that that could happen, but only if that word in the center, community, is actually centered. And I said I used to be an employment lawyer. I was an employment lawyer in San Francisco. I was a civil rights lawyer, and I focused on employment discrimination in Black communities. And so my main hub, the spot I spent most of my time, was Bayview Hunters Point. And that was right when SF Muni opened up a new line in Bayview Hunters Point. But as I was doing law there, no one wanted to talk to me about law, some 20-something lawyer. They didn't know me. I wasn't from the community. So first they wanted to know what I thought about the T-line. And they wanted to know what I thought about the T-line because folks didn't feel like it was built for them. They didn't feel like the leadership of SF Muni was thinking about the Black folks in Bayview's Hunters Point, this part of the city that is geographically isolated and cut off. Folks in the community thought that it was a transit line specifically to get 49ers fans before the stadium, before Levi's was built in Santa Clara. They thought that it was just built to get football fans to the stadium, which was in Bayview Hunters Point, right? And so that was, in their opinion, a failure of leadership. And again, this is an organization that understands the importance of leadership in our work. As I said, I'm on the board of Transit Center, and Transit Center puts out this report regularly. We actually have an updated one. And what really is impacting folks who use transit, right? And what we are constantly finding is things, again, that I'm guessing you all know. Housing costs. Can I live in a place where then I can also access transit? Phil Washington, who used to run LA Metro, would always say that people might think in transportation that housing isn't a transportation problem. But as people can no longer afford housing and they're being forced to move further out and they have to get places, it becomes a transportation problem, right? So housing costs and displacement, those two things always come up. We also hear a lot about changing demographics of community. Transit-oriented development is great. But who is that development for and who gets displaced? What are the changing demographics? And race matters, right? We have to talk about race. And the other thing we have to understand is if leadership is important when you're planning these things out and community members feel like no one talked to us, they feel like there's this disconnect between who works at these organizations and who rides, right? We know census numbers tell us that the majority of transit riders are women, people of color, and low-income folks, and often folks who really can check all of those boxes, right? But the demographics of transit agencies employees doesn't match that, right? Transit agencies are huge employers. Transit, driver jobs used to be this venue to the middle class, right? But what we've seen is that the folks leading these organizations are not women, right? Even though we know women ride transit, we know it's not folks of color. And so we're making these decisions without the folks who are using our services. Something else Transit Center did was they tried to measure the disparities in public transportation across different demographic groups. They started off with just 6 major cities, and they did this between February and 2020 and 2021, right? And this was this time, as I've already highlighted, where so many of our most enduring inequities were really magnified, both by COVID-19 and the constant taking of Black lives, which we were all in our homes just watching, right? And so in these 6 cities, Chicago, LA, New York, Philly, the Bay Area, and San Francisco and Washington, the 10, they all rank in the top 10 of the largest transit centers in the United States by ridership. And the reality is, what was found is people of color are more likely to commute by transit than white people, but far more jobs are accessible by driving than transit, right? Remember when I was talking about this new Mpact model, and one of them is mobilities and another is possibilities? the possibilities to have that upward mobility are expanded when you have a car. Because we found at Transit Center that it's just way easier. In Los Angeles, where I live, 17 times more jobs were available when you had a car, right? And we know nationwide, I said I'm rooting for everybody Black. Nationwide, Black households are the group least likely to have access to a private motor vehicle. So when you're thinking about how we want to impact people's lives, we have to think about how do we track equity, right? And we have to realize that in most of our cities, there are two-tier public transit systems, with one mode being more expensive. Think about an express bus or a commuter train, or even rail in a lot of places, and then buses, right? And so white commuters are able to get to their jobs in the city center, and then they can be whisked back to their nice communities at the end of the day. But usually a bus, which is less expensive and makes more stops, it might be cheaper, but it's more costly in terms of time, reliability, and ease of use, right? And so when we think about how we build our communities, we cannot do this work without talking about race. We cannot be afraid to talk about race. And not just externally. Too often people are like, I want to do equity. And they get excited. And they're like, I'm going to do this outward-facing equity work. But they don't realize that we have to also do this work in our organizations. How do we advance Black leaders? How do we acknowledge that no matter what field you're looking at, reputable sources like Harvard Business Review tell us that Black folks are still less likely to advance? And it's not just Black folks, right? Folks with disability, queer folks, folks who are religious minorities, women, right? Folks of color generally, just to survive in the workforce, we got to figure out the ways that white folks work. And then we have to figure out, how do we maintain in these organizations that still stay white? How do we acknowledge that organizational segregation is still persistent? That in many of our transportation systems, the folks at the top look very different than the folks driving the bus, right? And that many of us who get involved in the space feel like to succeed, we have to make ourselves invisible. We have to minimize ourselves, right? And that has to change. I started off by talking about the summer of 2020. And my hope is that during that summer, we learned a lot. Most importantly, how to listen to our communities, right? How to understand that we can't just talk about climate or transportation or housing. For the people we want to serve, these struggles are intrinsically tied together. We don't lead single issue lives, right? My hope is that we've learned that engagement, just going out there and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do, right? That's outreach. That's not engagement. Engagement is being willing to engage in that back and forth, to question tenets of white supremacy, like a false sense of urgency, our fear, our needing to be perfect and think that there's only one right way to do things, or thinking that progress is when things are bigger and there's more quantity over quality, right? Or that we have to have this right to comfort, that we can't have conflict, that we have to hoard power, and that we can only believe in things if it's written down, right? Instead of just listening. And again, if you've heard me speak, you've heard me say that grandmother who's peeking out of her blinds, those teenagers hanging out on the stoop or the corner, they can tell you everything you need to know about a community and how it's changing, right? And so we have to start thinking about our community as our partners. We have to be able to understand that strong community partnerships are key. We're no longer in a world in which there can be no community partnerships. We have to have strong community partnerships. And when we have strong community partnerships, it doesn't help if we have these strong community partnerships and then behind the scenes are our teams and our departments and our organization and our consultant, we're not all on the same page, right? Because no community member wants to come to a meeting and say, wasn't I just at a meeting? And you're like, oh, well, that was the housing team. That wasn't the transportation team. And so all partnership is not equal. We need partnership with community that is strong, that treats those community members as the experts that they are and hopefully pays them. But we also have to have our stuff together behind the scenes. And then we have to ask ourselves what we can do, right? First, we have to realize, I said one of the tenets of white supremacy is this desire to feel safe, right? And that's what we all want. I say we have to talk about race when we do this work, but talking about race is often scary for people because we want to be safe. We want a safe space. And what people mean when they say they want to feel safe is that they are scared. They have this fear. That's what they're not saying, that it's hard to do this work and center community and center race because we don't know what will happen all the times when we do that. And that's scary. And even scarier than not knowing what can happen is this fear we have of being called racist. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want people to think these things about us because oftentimes we're like, we're doing good work. We're public servants. We're out here trying to make things better. We can't be racist, right? But the reality is we have to get out of this desire to be in a safe space, right? We have to have courage. We have to get beyond being safe, and we have to get to the space where we're brave enough to know that we don't have to see somebody gasping for their last breath to center race, to do the right thing, to fight for equity. We have to have that courage. And you know what? We're going to mess up. We are absolutely going to mess up when we try to do this work. But even though we're going to mess up, and even though when we mess up, we are going to feel horrible, right? It doesn't feel good to mess up, but that doesn't mean we don't do it. We still got to take that leap to do things differently, to listen to community. And when we do get it wrong, we just got to say, well, look, I took the leap, but I'm going to shake it off and I'm going to keep going. I'm going to reflect on what I did that was wrong. I'm going to atone and say sorry. And then we're really going to stay committed to this work. We're really going to stay committed to doing things differently. And everyone likes to talk about equity, right? Everyone likes to say, I want to do equity work. But in order to do equity work, you can't talk about equity without talking about power. You can't talk about equity without talking about privilege. You have to be committed to really creating these spaces that, again, are not just safe spaces, but brave spaces where folks you're working with, whether they're community members or colleagues, feel like they can be brave enough to get it wrong, that there's going to be space and grace to move forward from those mistakes. And then, like I said, we can't talk about equity without talking about power. And an easy way to think about power is whenever you're making a decision, whether or not it's a program, a policy, a new route, whatever it is, you have to ask yourself, who is going to be most impacted by this decision? And that could be a good impact, it could be a bad impact, but who's going to be most impacted? And when you say to yourself, who's going to be most impacted, then look around at that decision-making table. And are those folks there? And if those folks aren't there, you have a power imbalance. And when you have that power imbalance, you can't have equity. No matter how much you want to say, but we are focused on equity. If you look around that decision-making table and you don't realize that maybe that's the wrong table, then you have to say, well, why? You have to analyze and challenge the privilege. Who's privileged enough to get into this room? Did they have to be able to come in the middle of the day? Did they have to be able to get paid to do this work? Did they have to have the transportation options? Did they have to have a fancy degree, right? These are the things that we have to do. And I've been ending my talks lately with this book, written by a professor out of Georgetown, got his PhD here at UCLA, and is a philosophy professor at a great Jesuit institution as a product of Jesuit education, Georgetown, right? And in this book, Femi is talking about reparations, right? Something that I think for a lot of us, we started to think about. And how do you think about reparations in a country that was built on stealing land from indigenous people and then building up our land and our wealth on the backs of enslaved folks, on the backs of Asian railroad workers, right? Like how do we think about reparations? And what Femi does in this book is he says, think about it in the scale of something that is global. And not just global, but he really uses climate change and resiliency, things that are important now more than ever, especially in places like Miami, right? He says, when you think about climate and when you think about reparation, we have to acknowledge that many of us have ancestors that were harmed by what he calls the global racial empire. But you know what? Many of us also have ancestors that helped that empire thrive. And so as a result, we can't look at reparations through fault. We can't look at reparations saying, well, your ancestors were slave owners, you're bad, you're at fault. Instead, we have to understand liability and the distribution and accumulation of advantages and disadvantages over time and space. So think about that for a moment. When I think about transportation, when I think about community building, when I think about transit-oriented development, that is an exercise where I can very concretely think about the distribution and accumulation of advantages and disadvantages over both time and space. And then Femi also asks us to take a minute to think about our ancestors and the type of ancestor we want to be. When I think about my work, I've already said my work is about rooting for everybody Black, helping Black communities. My work is about urban planning. My work is about centering Black women, right? All of these things. But the global racial empire wasn't built overnight. And so I don't have to change planning overnight. I don't have to change transit overnight. I have to figure out at my organization, at my agency, at my university, right? Whoever you are in the seat you're sitting in right now, finishing up your lunch, you have to ask yourself, what is my work? And how do I stay in this fight for social justice? How do I keep fighting injustice and inequities? And how do we give ourselves permission to know that we don't have to do all of this work on our own? But just like our ancestors, my ancestors, I have to advance it a little bit. I have to figure out what is going to be my role and making sure that I fight for centering community and making change. Thank you. I can dance.
Tamika, I hope you could still hear all that applause. And I just want to say thank you so much for this very thoughtful, thought-provoking, and yet so practical and also such a personal call to action. And I'm really thrilled. I'm very sorry that Tamika was not able to be here in person and couldn't actually be in a room with all of you. But I'm really thrilled to be wrapping the conference up with what is really a powerful and forceful call to do things differently. So thank you all, and I guess Tamika is now no longer with us. So I would like to call to the stage at this point a panel of local leaders, and we have asked them, because we weren't able to have Tamika here in person, we've asked them to offer reflections about what her comments and remarks mean here locally in the Miami region. I don't think are there stairs on that side? Oh, look at that, there are, okay. We are really grateful to all of these panelists, among many reasons. They really jumped into action at the last minute. This was a last-minute call for help when we realized Tamika would not be able to be here, and we are so grateful that you all could join us on such short notice. As you will many of you will probably recognize. All of our panelists here have also been speaking at other portions of the conference. I hope you've had a chance to hear them elsewhere as well. I will now introduce our wonderful moderator, who will then introduce the panel. Grace Crunican is the owner and principal of Crunican LLC. She has held numerous, too numerous to count really, high-level positions through which she has shaped transit in this country. Among them, she's been general manager of BART, director of the Seattle Department of Transportation, director of the Oregon State Department of Transportation, and deputy administrator of the FTA, and the list goes on. Grace is also on the board of Mpact, which we are thrilled about. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Grace to lead a discussion with our fabulous panelists about what Tamika's call to action means to them.
Thank you very much. Do we have the mics on? Everything good? Okay. Before we begin, I would just want us to all take a minute to thank the people that made this conference happen and served us today. I don't think they're in the room, but they're going to communicate this. So let's give a round of applause for all the labor that put us together here. Folks in the back of the room. Rod's over here. He marked us up. Really appreciate the support we've been given. It's been a lovely conference. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel. Commissioner Eileen Higgins. She has served as Miami-Dade's commissioner since 2018. She got her graduate degree from New Mexico. She's acted as not acted, I guess that's a poor choice, isn't it? She's worked as an engineer in mechanical manufacturing for 20 years, streamlining processes, manufacturing processes. She got her MBA from Cornell. She has been a foreign service officer at the State Department and a director of the country director in Belize for the Peace Corps. So she's had quite a background. Please welcome Eileen Higgins. Next to her is Eulois Cleckley, who is Director and CEO of the Department of Transportation and Public Works for Miami-Dade County. He's also been the Executive Director for the Department of Transportation Infrastructure in the City and County of Denver, Colorado, and Deputy Director of Houston-Galveston MPO. He got his undergraduate degree in transportation and the transportation, the economy, economics.
Economics.
Yeah, okay. 2 degrees. Thank you, sir. From North Carolina A&T. Welcome, Eulois. Thank you for being with us. And last but certainly not least is Grace Perdomo. Grace, I've had an interesting conversation with her earlier, and we'll try and draw some of that out. But she is the Executive Director of Transit Alliance Miami, as was noted earlier, a nonprofit that advances better transit, bikeability, walkability here in Miami-Dade County. Her undergraduate and master's degree are from the University of Miami in architecture and urban design, and she worked in that business in the private sector, working with public and private clients for 25 years. And she is a data-driven woman, and I think we'll start there. With the challenge that was given to us by Tamika, and she talked about what is my work. I wish you would share with us kind of what your work is here and how you pull out the questions of equity and commitment that were mentioned by Tamika in the presentation.
Thank you, Grace. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Rail Volution for such an inspiring and impactful conference. You clearly leave after 3 days of a better dancer, I hope. And most certainly leave energized with the work that we have ahead. But I wanted to start out by giving a big shout to nonprofit advocacy organizations and community-based organizations in the room. Thank you. This work is hard, right? We know that, but we walk the talk, and we certainly bring it home to community, and most importantly, bring community to the table, which I think is critical and clearly what Tamika was talking about. Transit Alliance Miami's work is very much focused on data-driven process and research, and clearly embedded in community engagement. But we look at numbers or data rather, and it's not just about numbers. It's really about people and stories. And we find that our work is very much focused on how we engage community and how we draw perspectives of what are the needs that clearly define how we resolve issues with transit and mobility, right? I look at transit and mobility from the perspective of an urban designer and city planner because that is my background. But clearly I'm fascinated by how I have the 4 R's, how we restore, reclaim, reimagine, and rebuild our physical infrastructure to really make improvements in our city urban fabric to enhance and provide access to improved transit and mobility.
Grace, talk about, if you would, you have to be a partner with the folks that are up here, and you have to be an advocate at the same time.
Yes.
And sometimes there's a conflict with that. Would you please explain that to the
Yeah, and I
Bravo
love that
confidence.
line that Tamika mentioned about staying consistent, because we always need to keep working changes, not here, or something like that, right? So fine line to draw between being an activist and an advocate, and also being a partner. And sometimes that doesn't put us in the most popular of positions. Sometimes it does. It depends. I know a lot of folks in the room can relate to that. But I think that, again, it's about having a conversation and reframing the discussion and looking at different perspectives and finding ways in which we can work together, right? We've heard in these 3 days a lot about systems thinking and integrating. We love the word intersectionality, right, between all these different areas that do impact transit and mobility, like housing, like health, like
So here's a
climate action.
conflict that I've been trying to listen to you on. We've got a new bus network that's supposed to be ready to go, and it's my understanding you actually raised some money in your organization to help the planning of this. Is that correct? And the county matched that money. Is that right? So partnership.
Yep.
Okay.
Correct, yes.
Plan put together.
Transit Alliance led the largest and first grassroots effort driven by a nonprofit advocacy organization to redesign the bus network.
How much money did you
And
come up with?
it was total of $500,000. $250,000 came from funders like Transit Center, Miami Foundation, Microsoft, Verizon, and Health South Florida. And the previous administration matched it with a budget allocation of $250,000. And we engaged Jarrett Walker, which many of you know in the room, to provide the technical support for that effort. And Transit Alliance led the on-the-ground grassroots effort.
So you came up with the information
Right.
in partnership with the county, and decisions were made, and the county, the commissioner took some heat, and the transit agency took some heat to make some changes. They weren't all that popular, but all of them. But you did that, and now where's that network?
Yeah, it's coming.
So it's Christmas. Huh?
Yeah, so I'll just, well, one, I want to thank Tamika Butler for being a part of the closing ceremony today. And I've known Tamika for a while, and she never ceases to amaze every time I listen to her. I appreciate the way she challenges professionals within the transportation industry around equity in transportation, how it really impacts people. And then she turns around and scares the hell out of everybody, right? But it's done purposeful, because the challenge to make sure that every single day that we're focusing on figuring out ways to improve our system and address the ills of the past is part of our responsibility as public servants and the folks that help support us. So I just want to give a shout out to her. But with respect to the Better Bus Network, which again is an example of how the layers of leadership kind of come together to figure out how to make improvements in people's lives. So Commissioner Higgins is the chair of our Transportation Committee, who is a strong transit advocate. We have Grace Perdomo, who is on the true advocacy side. Our county mayor, Daniela Olivian-Cava, which did the opening remarks yesterday or 2 days ago, who actually ran on the fact that we needed to improve our bus system through implementation of the Better Bus Network. And then the last piece is the implementing user departments like my department. And so that's where the rubber meets the road, no pun intended. But we're responsible for making sure we deliver on the expectations. And it's been difficult because the pandemic and the different economic pressures that we've been enduring over the past year and a half has created a significant issue with respect to having enough bus operators to actually implement the Better Bus Network. We are currently running at 160 vacancies in our bus operator group. And that's the fact that we need to add in an additional 80 bus operators to actually fully implement the Better Bus Network just creates an issue. However, that's not stopping us. We have been working with the Transit Alliance, coming up with alternative ways to recruit, develop partnerships. And
What are some of those ways?
So first thing is, we actually made a determination to provide an incentive for people to come on board with us. So we offered a $5,000 signing bonus we offered a $500 referral bonus. So the staff that is a part of our current department have the opportunity to receive that incentive. And that goes up all the way up to $2,000, depending on if we can get somebody that comes in and they stay with us over 18 months. And that had direct impact where we're averaging around 20 to 25 trainees in our training classes per month, and we're at a point now where that's doubled, where we have 40 to upwards to 40 people in our training classes. We're looking at partnering with our community college here, Miami-Dade College, to develop a pipeline of potential candidates that can come in with CDLs so we can get right into our training courses. And then we're partnering with other providers as well to figure out if we can take a look at shifting some of our resources around. And the last piece that we've done is we've kind of gotten our act together internally, where we've hired some really good service planners. This is not the sexy stuff that you like to hear about, but you got to get you have to get the fundamentals down and make sure that your service planning arm is well equipped to make sure that you make service adjustments. And in our next lineup, we're going to be happy to report that we actually improved our runtime. So by doing so, your on-time performance improves, so the customer is going to get a benefit. But as we did that, we're actually going to free up about 8 operators that we don't now need to operate our existing service. And so these things kind of layer on each other, and then we'll be in a better position by the middle part of next year to begin to implement the Better Bus Network.
So was that a commitment to the middle part of next year? Did we record that?
Yeah, I've written it down.
I said it, don't write it down. I said it.
Nobody gave me a pen. But we should talk about equity in this project. To go back to what Tamika is challenging us to do. This project, when it got started, was very much a database project, right? We had not redesigned our bus network in over 40 years. So fundamentally, it just went wherever it used to go. And our community had changed dramatically. And the wait times between buses were outrageous. Like in the middle of the day, you could wait 45 minutes. Well, guess what? That's not transportation. And so with Transit Alliance's help, everything was about being and building this efficient network where your connections were better and where a bus could come every 10 to 15 minutes, even during the middle of the day, right? So that you could literally become a car-free person, or if you are a low income, many of our bus riders are completely dependent on public transportation. They have no choice. They're service sector workers, they're low-wage workers. And so when we don't have frequency during the day and we don't have good connections of times, we're really making their lives miserable, right? And in doing that, there was some ruthless data around frequency. We got to get rid of our low ridership routes. And so that was kind of, Transit Alliance really pushed. And I would sit there like, but these are poor people on this route. And they're like, well, there's not enough ridership. It's inefficient. But it ended up, if we cut some of those routes, we were cutting out some of the poorest people in our county from access to jobs, access to education, and access to medical care. And so we actually took the decision. I think I probably fought with the mayor, and I get along. We're fast friends, but every now and then we have to fight, usually over money. But we decided to commit $20 million extra dollars so we could actually keep our low ridership routes. And I know that may sound a bit like an anathema to transit efficiency people, but we have poor people all over the county, and many of them live very far away from where we are now. And so we need our low ridership routes, because otherwise these people are literally trapped at home. And that is not what government is for. We are here to make sure that every one of our residents has a chance to build a decent light. And so that was push and pull. That was when the advocacy groups were telling us, don't serve these people. And actually it was like the government official goes, what are you talking about? We are going to build equity. And so into the Better Bus Network. And I think we're pretty proud of it. We just need to hire a few more bus drivers, so get ready to be on the bus time next time you're in Miami.
And you had the data available to know what you were doing and what you weren't doing,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
not in terms of just transit efficiency, but who was getting
Yes.
dissed, who was getting
The
served.
process is never an easy conversation. As Tamika pointed out, as we all know, it's a very messy conversation. And oftentimes there's a number of trade-offs that go into that, right? So by having at the community at the table, our number one priority was really to addressing transit and mobility with an equity perspective from day one. And considering that in Miami-Dade County, there are 4 to 5 transit riders ride Metrobus, it really is the backbone of our transit service and our transit and mobility network in the county. It also was the workhorse during the pandemic, where it continued to provide that vital service, especially considering that 36% of workers in Miami-Dade County are essential workers, and it was the #1 way that they were getting around. The data is impressive in terms of how this bus network will increase the percentage of access to jobs by the community. So one of the things that we've been doing in the past year is one where we've been highlighting the urgency of getting the bus network off the ground clearly. We understand that the bus operator shortage and shortfall is a crisis that everyone throughout the country is facing, right?
So one of the issues that was raised by Tamika is that we don't live single issue lives, right?
Correct.
And transit is kind of a single issue agency on its own. It needs its citizens to get involved. But I wanted to give the commissioner a chance to tell you about the ADU vote that happened yesterday. And the tie to land use and transportation is something that Mpact has been talking about for 26 years now as a convener. And giving people affordable places to live next to transit is extremely important to the development. Would you please give us a sense of, and go a little deep on it, if you would, what's included?
Yeah, so our county has, like many of you, I'm sure are doing, has had very deep and very thoughtful discussions, and sometimes heated discussions around what does land use look like as we face affordability crisis. Secretary Fudge came here and basically told the world that Miami is the epicenter of the affordable housing crisis in our country, and she is right. The average price of a home has doubled since before the pandemic. It's nearly $600,000. A one-bedroom apartment is well over $2,000. Our average median income is in $50,000. Nobody can afford to live here if you're a worker, right? So affordable housing built near reliable public transportation is even more affordable, right? Because you don't need a car, you don't need gas, you don't need insurance. And it is crucial as local government that we begin to put these land use policies in place to allow more affordable housing in all kinds of shapes and sizes to happen. And so, you know, we've battled and fought, and I think we have some of the, I mean, I challenge other people, but I think we have now come up with rapid transit zoning near all of our transit corridors that allow for density in the really dense areas like we are now, quite frankly, unlimited height. As we go into more of the suburban areas, you might have an 8-story apartment building and other things around our stations and our corridors. But in doing that land use zoning, as we finally, I can't build you a train and only let 4 people live next to it, right? Like, we need to have people to have access to our transportation system. But we also know that a lot of the land, some of it's county-owned land, but a lot of it is private developer land. So in exchange for being part of rapid transit zoning, we have made it a requirement that a minimum of 12.5% of the units be affordable and workforce. And we also give density bonuses for building additional workforce units. We've tried to be creative in our zoning. So, for example, we also have now finally zoned co-living, which is another experiment for younger people and young professionals that want to,
or older people.
And older people that
Co-living,
want company for co-living, right? So, for example, we've got it's a private sector building under construction right near one of our transit stops. There's 4 bedrooms, they're leased out individually, and they share a kitchen and living environments. And so that's something we've got now, I think 7 or 8 of these buildings all around the county. We're experimenting and have zoned micro units so we can start to build smaller. I mean, when they tell me the size of these, I'm like, oh, well, that's like twice my New York City apartment when I lived there. But for us, it sounds really small here in Miami. And then accessory dwelling units. We had quite the meeting yesterday, barely got it across the finish line. But the idea of in our single family neighborhoods, and listen, in a perfect world, we'd have density near transit everywhere, but let's face it, we're now adding transit to an already built out environment.
Retrofit.
Right,
That's
so
what we're all
guess
doing.
what? We have single family neighborhoods near transit, right? And we're not gonna get rid of them. We also have, but we have an affordability crisis, and so yesterday we took the step of allowing people to build and permit, right, and have inspections, so legally permit accessory dwelling units. So You could rent that out if you wanted. Your grandma could live there. Your kids could graduate from college, and you could get them out of your kitchen into their own little space. But you would think we were trying to ruin the world by trying to solve our affordable housing crisis.
And to that point, if I may add, this is where a community-based organization has a really important role to fill in the community. And that is that we take very complex concepts, right? Very much transportation engineering speak, and we translate it for the community. So our campaigns have been very much focused on raising awareness. We have really moved the needle in a place like Miami since we came in the space in 2016, 2017, with really taking data, again, that is very complex, and translating it to folks, really explaining how zoning and housing has an impact on transit ridership and transit availability. We ran a campaign with the Rapid Transit Zone, which was approved as an ordinance recently, really walking people through the ABCs of what that means and how that impacts more than anything their lives. So I think and also a key role that we all know is that of building capacity and leadership, and really giving people the tools to understand how all these ordinances, legal things, engineering things impact their daily lives.
Yeah, and Commissioner Higgins always says that, transit in our department, we are just as much of as a developer as the private industry is, and our other entities that are responsible for developing affordable housing. I'll give you an example. We are moving forward with a development on our Palmetto Station, which is coming on the north side of the county, off of the Green Line, and it's an opportunity that we're going to have a development that will have over 1,000 workforce and affordable housing units available. And as a part of that particular development, we've embedded in the development agreement a category that allows some of the workforce housing to be eligible for our transit workers. And that's a unique case for somebody in my position where we're trying to hire folks and we're still running into this affordability issue, and being able to have a development that's going to be run by a nonprofit that has 100% workforce housing and have my staff to take advantage of that development is how we can contribute to solving some of the issue. The other piece for us, since we have this huge SMART program where we're expanding out our mass transit lines, one of which is called the South Corridor. It's a bus rapid transit corridor that we're currently building out, one of the longest all-electric BRT systems that you'll have in the country. That spurred additional development as well, where we're adding in thousands of affordable and workforce housing units adjacent to that BRT project. And so, it takes a variety of different policy measures as well as working with different partners to be able to address the issue and start to better link transportation with land use. Last thing before we get off of Better Bus Network, with respect to some of the numbers and the impact of that, the Better Bus Network is really about frequency, right? And what we ended up doing as a part of the final plan is actually increasing the percent of those living in poverty within a quarter mile of a bus stop. We increased that significantly, where the amount of people living in poverty in access within a quarter mile of a high-frequency stop has more than doubled. And so that's the end result of dealing all the analysis, taking the data, making the proper route changes, and trying to implement. You'll have an impact there.
Thanks, because that's where I was going, is to bring the data home.
Yep.
You've used it, and to meet Tamika's challenge on equity, you've really designed some transit systems, really complements the North Corridor itself. You've said is one of the biggest equity projects in the country.
Yeah.
So,
and on that point, so I talked about the South Corridor. The North Corridor is, I say this every single time, this is the biggest equity project for this county, and I would say for the entire country. So the history, and it's interesting.
Say it until they challenge it.
Yeah.
Just go ahead. It's all right.
Yeah, and so we need money from the federal government. But it's interesting. So Tamika made a statement. She said, I don't know if y'all caught this. She said that highways are racist. Did everybody catch that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, okay, so I don't know about you, but the concrete had to get somewhere. There was a design for that particular system. So the inanimate object, the highway itself, that's the only thing I would disagree with her, is not racist. the people that designed the highway and planned the highway and purposely made those decisions to build it in separate communities, that's the focus. The heart and the impotence by making that decision is what you have to challenge in terms of the mindset. And so I think we're at a point now where when we start talking about equity, again, it goes back to fixing those bad planning and design decisions that somebody made 60 years ago. So the North Corridor is the one corridor that we can move forward with to fix a bad planning decision that had to deal with the fact that the interstate went through Overtown, which is a majority African-American neighborhood, and displaced thousands of people.
All over the country it happened.
All over the country.
It's the chosen alignments, right? That
Absolutely.
were wrong to begin with.
Bingo. And so 60 years ago, that decision was made, and it is still creating an issue where you displaced folks and did not invest into that community, where everybody got displaced too. They have lack of access from a transportation perspective.
So you use data in this situation to create a very equitable system, and you have several lines, and the bus network is one, the North Corridor is another, and you witnessed bad land use decisions that were made 60 years ago. Let's talk about yesterday, because at the same time you did that progressive policy on ADU. We also need to confess before the group here that your council expanded the urban growth boundary, and we got Eulois providing the best transportation system here and very focused on equity and serving people, and then you get this dropped on you by the city council. Could you talk about that?
Well,
How'd that go?
I voted against that, so don't lump me in with all this.
I'm not. I'm just asking you to explain it to this room, because we've heard about all this progressive stuff, and tell us about it, how it fits together.
Okay, so one of the fun things about being in local government is it's a push-pull. Miami-Dade County, we're a giant place. We really did expand with no planning, right? I mean, if you leave this downtown area and you go around, you're like, what the heck, right? The streets are everywhere. There's no connectivity. Traffic is terrible, yada, yada, yada. So we have what's called the urban development boundary, where we theoretically, although destroyed yesterday, we theoretically have a policy that says we're going to develop within the urban development boundary. We have a lot of undeveloped land within that boundary where we can, both industrial lands, agricultural lands, hands for housing, and that we would only develop outside of that boundary, which, by the way, most of the lands outside the boundary are very environmentally fragile, right? In this case, we gave 350 acres, and just to give you a sense of scale, there are 8 cities in our county, right? This is bigger than 8 cities. So we literally gave these people enough land. And when I go down the property tax rolls of these 8 cities that are smaller than this space, some of them are worth $3 billion, some of them are worth $500 million. So the kind of money we just gave away to a couple of rich guys, for nothing. We got no community benefits part of that. And so we're adding to sprawl, like adding to sprawl. And they theoretically, now it's zoned, they can do whatever they want with it, but there's absolutely, under Florida state law, we cannot constrain them. They literally, tomorrow, can sell their property. And right now, the properties that are outside the urban development boundary, which they knew these prices, all told that's worth $20 million. 2 miles away inside the UDB, it's worth $86 million. So they literally can sell this property and make $66 million extra dollars. And I don't believe we got any offset of the impacts, right? So if our commission, and clearly our commission is willing to expand the urban development boundary, we need a process whereby we the people, we the residents, have those impacts offset, the environmental impacts and the sprawl impacts. And so I voted against it because I think the process is very much flawed, where we just make rich people richer without making sure our community gets richer at the same time. But, you win some, you lose some. It's a democracy. I won on ADUs. I lost on this. That's how life goes.
Thank you.
I'll add 2 things to that. One of them is that the result of it is really tragic. It's a tragedy because, in a way, it's going to have a negative impact on our very delicate Everglades ecosystem. So it's really no different than building a highway through an African-American neighborhood, right? It's kind of our times version of that, right? And the other thing is that studies have proven that we have enough capacity within the urban boundary to build enough to cover the growth trends that we're going to be seeing as a county, again, within our urban development boundaries.
So we leave the three of you behind to deal with this, but I think you have done a lot for equity, and you've focused it. You've leveraged your community in. You've got Eulois working like a dog trying to get the transit system to respond, and we've got great leadership on the part of Commissioner here. So I think we're all thrilled for that. Tamika said you're not going to win them all. But you won some yesterday, you lost some, and the work continues, and it continues for all of us, but it really continues for all of you, and we all thank you for your work, and thank you for being panel members. So thank you very much. Nice job.